Okay, well, welcome everybody. It's always lovely to see you on this call, and we've started to see a few regulars join us, so thank you for that. Thanks for being avid supporters of the Conversations at Work series. My name is Bev. I'm from a company called Jostle. We're the creator of an employee intranet based in Vancouver, and my job at Jostle is to spur thought leadership and create conversation around things that are really impacting people in the workplace today. So today's topic is particularly relevant because leaders influence workplaces all around the world with the words they choose to use, and obviously the related behaviors that come from those words. So that's why we're having this conversation today, and I'm really delighted to be joined by all of you, but in particular our guests for today are Tara Cree and Laurie Bennett. I know both Laurie and Tara very well. They're both here in Vancouver, and I've worked with them on a number of occasions and have collaborated with them as well. So thank you for your time and your energy to help us push this very important topic forward. And I hope that at the end of this conversation today, we'll all be thinking a bit more clearly about what it is that we want to see in leaders and how we as leaders ourselves should be reflecting on and thinking about the words that we choose to use and the nonverbal language that we exhibit as well in our day-to-day work. So if just a few quick housekeeping items. This is an open conversation. We are trying to create dialogue here. It's a safe space for us all to share and add to the conversation. So it's definitely less webinar and more fireside chat, so please do feel free to contribute. I would ask that everybody who isn't speaking have themselves on mute, and if you would like to join in with a comment or a question, you're welcome to unmute and say, I'd like to ask a question, or you can use the raise hand tool in Zoom, which I believe is in the participants view. So if you just go to your own name and drop down, there should be a raise hand feature there. So please feel free to use that. And we are going to start with a breakout session, which will get us all kind of juiced up and ready to contribute to the conversation. So that will be a nice way for us to kick things off. So as I mentioned earlier, so today we are thinking about leadership voices and the power of those voices in workplaces. And I think we can all agree that over the past few months, we've seen very visible examples of leadership and the way that leaders use their voices in both bad and good ways to help others and to bring people along through this pandemic. And I don't think I even need to name names. I think we know a very good example of a global leader who is not doing a very good job of demonstrating leadership and helping his people through this global climate and this global health crisis. But there are also really great examples around the world of people who are at a very small scale doing amazing work, as well as at a global level. So there's a lot to celebrate, but there's a lot for us to call out as well. And we should pay attention to what's happening in the world and learn from this, because if we can take something away from this crisis, then it would have been for nothing. So anyway, let's get right to it. So we're going to look at this topic at three different levels today. We're first going to look at the individual level, about how leaders make us feel as individuals with their good or their bad words. We're going to have a look at it as an impact on workplace culture. And then we're going to have a look at leadership interactions and language for online engagement, which we know is a big part of how we're all operating at the moment. So why don't we jump right into it? We're going to start by having a breakout session, and we're going to do, let's see, there's 11 of us. Tara and Laurie, how many groups do you think we should have for the 11 of us to make this sort of a healthy, meaningful conversation at the group level?
A couple, or maybe three?
I was going to say three.
Yeah,
okay.
Let's do three.
Well, why don't we do 3 breakouts? And if we're just remembering that we're looking at this through the individual lens, we're going to ask the question, how does the language of good versus bad leaders make us feel? So that could be words, it could be nonverbal language, any sort of interaction that you've had that either made you feel good or bad. And we really wanted to be talking about real examples if you're willing to share those, or maybe things that you've observed in others from afar or even on your own team. So why don't we break out into the groups? We'll do 3 groups. We'll have a conversation for 10 minutes, and then we'll come back and share what we all heard. So if that sounds good, and hopefully I didn't miss anything to get us started off here, but let's get us going into these groups. So I'm just going to do random groups, 3 groups. And I'll jump into one of the groups as well. All right, we'll see you back here in 10 minutes. Welcome back, everybody. Did everyone make it back in one piece? Awesome. So sorry, there was a bit of a hiccup in the beginning there. I put all the guests and the moderator in one group, and everybody else had to fend for themselves. So sorry about that. But here we are back together again, and maybe I'll ask group number 1, who Ashley, Faye, Laurie, Jaden, and Tara, if someone would like to start by just sharing a few thoughts or your own thoughts of what you shared in your group.
Yeah, how about maybe somebody else other than me, since I'll be doing a little bit of talking afterwards.
I'm going to volunteer Ashley.
I was just thinking, oh, great, Laurie's going to volunteer. And then you said my name. Okay, sure. So we were talking about, well, I gave an example of a boss that was speaking with her communication style, which was very direct and very imperative. And it had the effect on me of kind of shutting down my motivation. Like, it had the complete opposite effect. And then that, got us talking, and Faye has shared an experience as well where it was indirect kind of communication, referring to her using her position rather than her actual name, and she was the only one holding that position. And you feel like there's no trust, demotivated, and then it led us to a conversation on, okay, having a conversation about the intent versus impact, which Tara spoke about, and assuming positive intent in your interactions, but taking time to actually have the conversation where you are analyzing that moment and saying how, when you do this, this is how it impacts me. This is how I feel. And look at that with some acknowledge it and some self-awareness, so that the person can be aware of how they're impacting you, because they just might be oblivious to that. And they're just doing their best, working how they work, talking how they talk, having a dismal, terrible, demoralizing effect on people. Did I kind of capture it? Yeah.
It sounds a little bit like you're suggesting that we give people the benefit of the doubt as well sometimes. Obviously, if people's behavior is, they show up in that way repeatedly all the time, then you're less likely going to give them the benefit of the doubt. But we don't know what else is going on in the leader's life and in their head, and things that are happening in their personal space. So sometimes we do need to extend the respect both ways.
Yeah, and it can be an episode that you give a benefit of the doubt, or even a pattern to give a benefit of the doubt. If there's a pattern, it might just be a lack of awareness of the impact that they're having. So you can still give a benefit of the doubt with a perceived negative pattern, but then it needs addressed.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, thanks, Ashley. Let's switch to the second group. Anyone on that team? Simon, Julia, Misty, Laurie. I was in there briefly, thank you, but I had to skip out, so I won't be the one speaking for the group. Anyone like to volunteer a few ideas or thoughts?
I can speak a little bit particular to what I shared, but ahead of COVID, we also dealt with dramatic funding cuts from Alberta Education. And we were no shortage of crisis for our organization. So we were just talking a little bit about how it's interesting of what you don't even realize you need from a leader until the environment changes. And so we've been afforded a very autonomous leader at our organization that has served us all very well. We have a strong leadership team, and we do our things, and we have a lot of creative space, and it's been amazing. But it was interesting when, you know, the world was imploding a little bit. We were looking for that kind of take charge, and so it is interesting to see how sometimes the skill sets are needed in the different dynamics. And I was just referencing that one of my colleagues who oversees one of our large programs has had to make some really incredibly hard decisions, and has done it with such grace and empathy and vulnerability and transparency, and it has, I think the individual impact has been huge for that. So yeah, it's been wonderful to see that, and very inspiring.
Yeah, and it definitely sets the tone for how you navigate as a group through a difficult time, right? And the leader can make or break that experience. They can make you want to keep going along, or feel completely demoralized and want to uncouple yourself from that interaction, right? Or that project, or just even working together as a group, as a company, to get through something like a global crisis that we're facing, right? So thank you, Misty. That was a very positive story that you shared, and was wonderful to hear that. Before we skip over into our next topic around the workplace culture impact, I'd love to ask Laurie and Tara. Both of you are at the front lines with observing companies who are working through challenging leadership situations, and you work with leaders one-on-one as well in a coaching capacity. Perhaps you could each share with us what you've observed in terms of how are leaders having to change the way that they show up, and the words and the language and the gestures that they're using? Like what's changing, and why do leaders need to change? So either Laurie or Tara, whoever wants to go first.
You want to go first, Tara?
Sure. Thank you. So from my perspective, I would say that, and actually reflects a little bit about what we were talking about in our breakout room, from moving from, you know, sort of a very action-oriented, task-focused style to be one much more focused on empathy and connection and relationships. And in particular, right now, when mental health concerns are such, you know, mental health issues are such a concern, given all of the anxiety around COVID and what's happening, it's even more important that leaders are taking the time to connect in on a personal level with people, demonstrating empathy, really truly listening so that people feel heard. Just by having someone be able to express what's going on for them, that it will bring down anxiety levels, and people will feel more supported and connected. So I think it isn't just about results, and it is about connecting and making people feel supported. A lot of leaders that I work with don't know how to do that. They've been successful because they achieve results. They're action oriented, they get things done, they get the sales, they get the results, and that's what they've been rewarded for. And so to make that shift to actually having to connect with people in a not about the task is really challenging for some people. So that's a shift that I spend actually a lot of time working with leaders on, is how do they develop those skills to be able to do that. Some of it is awareness about just recognizing they need to do that. But then there's also a skill acquisition piece where they need to, all of these things can be learned, luckily.
Yeah, absolutely. And the importance of voice and the connection with people through words, and using empathy, especially when we're on online calls for the most part these days, or on telephone calls, right? It's very hard. I mean, it's hard enough to achieve this in person, isn't it? To now have to do it online is even more challenging, but we're going to get to that a little bit later. But thanks, Tara. So Laurie, what are you seeing on your end of things?
Oh, similar. It's such a juicy moment to be watching leaders, and gosh, there's so much empathy for them. And in our group also, we had Julia giving us her perspective as a leader in the kind of position that Misty was talking about in her organization, and just watching leaders have to tread this line between bringing conviction and belief in their business and their people and direction to a company that suddenly finds itself in really uncertain times and in crisis, whilst at the same time not doing that in a way that feels like it's disempowering to people or ignoring the specific experiences that they find themselves in. So trying to still be co-creative and to open up and to allow people inside the company to have a voice. It's such a strong tension. It's such a delicate path to walk. And I think, I think what, from my perspective, what the COVID crisis has done is really just shine a spotlight on shifts in leadership that are starting to happen now as a result of people just being fed up with feeling the kind of feelings that some of you spoke of in that opening group inside business, and a recognition that those are counterproductive to performance, to people's joy in the work that they do. And so just noticing how stark it's become to spot the kind of leaders who still seek authority over openness, or still looking to be the kind of all-knowing, safe, I've got it all sorted communication, versus the more vulnerable, actually something like this has never happened before. I'm not sure exactly what to do, but here's how we could move forward. So starting to bring a bit more vulnerability into their work. The need that so many leaders feel to solve and to fix the problems that they see inside their business, rather than to simply experience them alongside their colleagues and the people that they work with. And, I think if there was one word that you would pluck for leaders to tattoo on their foreheads right now, it's empathy, which really just an invitation to not necessarily need to be in front of your people or behind them, but to be able to walk alongside them and really be in the experience that they are in, and start your communication from that place. Feels like it's the route to bridging some of those tensions between being the flag bearer at the front and being the person who's there to kind of bring voice to the surface too.
Yeah, I love that you emphasize the empathy in how our leaders need to be thinking and showing up alongside their team members right now. And that gives us a nice opportunity to switch into what that starts to look like when leaders are showing up in that way, in terms of the workplace itself and the culture that creates. So, Laurie, perhaps you could give us a sense of, if we're staying in the realm of the power of voice and the words that leaders are using, what might some empathetic oriented words look like that a vulnerable, courageous, connected leader would use right now? Like, can you share some examples for us?
Yeah, I think for me, the specific words follow a few other steps that I think leaders take in that space. And I know Ashley mentioned the difference between our intention and our impact. And I think there's a starting point for leaders before they open their mouths to reflect on the intention that they're bringing into a communication or a conversation right now, and what's really needed from them to feel like they can understand and listen to where their organization is, where people are, the kinds of things they're struggling with, before they feel the need to add their opinion to that. And I think when leaders show up in their most empathic, I think is when they're able to open a space for people to share where they really are right now. And I think it's interesting, as you say, the kind of how this reflects on the culture of organizations, and noticing through this period, organizations that have built a foundation of trust, where people feel like they can be vulnerable, are so much more able to step into a space of connecting with each other on an emotional level, not just a task focused level. So leaders being able to ask people, how they are right now and how they really are right now, as opposed to just the first answer that arrives. Their ability to invite, not to protect themselves from the truth of how people are feeling and what's going on in their business right now, but to really open themselves to it and feel like they can share in that same way, to model what it looks like for people to be able to speak to how they really are in that space. And I think that ability for a leader to show up with vulnerable language about how they are coping with what's going on right now or not coping with it, how they are able to reflect on what they feel confident in and where they don't, really opens a floor for other people to step into that space alongside them, and start to use that same sort of language with each other in and around their organizations.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. I think it also speaks to relatability and making yourself relatable and open to those around you. And Tara, what are you seeing with the leaders that you might be counseling right now around how honest are they being about their impact on their culture in the way that they show up?
Can you rephrase the question? How honest are they being about their impact on their culture?
Yeah, do they actually realize the responsibility that they have for their culture as leaders? And do they realize that their words and how they show up actually frame that culture?
Right. Yeah. So it's interesting. I was actually just having a conversation with a leader yesterday about this, about who owns the culture, and in an organization, and so you know, her perspective was, you know, that's not my job, right? There's a CEO up there, and there's an executive team, and then I'm right below them, and they own the culture, and I think that in some organizations and some leaders actually believe that. And so it's a mindset shift required to say, actually, we all own the culture and we all have an impact on the culture. And whenever I create leadership models for organizations, the cultural ambassador role is always a core component of a leadership model in terms of a competency, that this is a behavior that we are all cultural ambassadors. And what does that mean? Is that we need to, what we say and how we behave needs to align with the culture that we want to have in our organization. So I would say it varies from leader to leader. I think there are some exceptional leaders who really do understand that they are cultural ambassadors and that everything they do and say is either breaking down or building up the culture that they want to have. And then there's other leaders who really are clueless about that. And that's part of the journey about helping them to build up this mindset of the impact that they have. And I think it comes from them getting some feedback. So going back to that intent and impact conversation that we had, understanding that their intent, it's not enough to just focus on what you intended. You need to focus on the impact that you're having. But how do you know what the impact is? That's through feedback. And that's a vulnerable thing to open yourself up to. So it links nicely to, you know, what Laurie was talking about in terms of vulnerability. I mean, and of course it goes to the Brene Brown work that I love and do, is, you know, vulnerability right now is a big thing. I mean, we need leaders to understand what vulnerability is, what it's not, so that they can lean into that vulnerability, because that's how they're going to be able to demonstrate empathy. And because even the demonstration of empathy is a scary, risky thing. If you ask somebody truly how they're doing, you risk them becoming emotional and telling you something that you're uncomfortable hearing. And so that's why we tend to avoid that. And that's why usually when we say, how are you? People are just like, okay, and that's all I want. Right. And if I came and I was like, hey, Simon, how you doing today? And he's like, and he goes into some big thing about some, I'd be like, no, I just wanted the okay. Right. I didn't want to hear more than the okay. And so it throws people off. So we need to have everybody believing that they own a part in that.
Yeah, absolutely. Here at Jostle, we've just gone through, a phase of really understanding how our people are doing, by checking in with them. And we've really been encouraging our team leads to ask the question, how are you doing really? And the really piece is actually that gets you past that just getting the okay answer. And it really gives everybody permission to ask that question, because even the CEO is asking that question, right? So I think that's an example of how one word can actually change the expectation or the permission or the invitation for conversation between two people, between a group of people. Does anybody else have any examples of how leader words impact culture either positively or negatively that they might want to share? You just unmute yourself and jump right in.
So I guess I have one, but it's not really a value judgment at all. It's just something I've been saying a lot, and I've been wondering how other people are encountering this, and Tara and Laurie, when you've both spoken about vulnerable leadership, I think a phrase I've been trying to embrace as a leader of a small company are the words, I don't know. However, I think I struggle with how often to say that, when to say that, right? Because it goes back to, what I was sharing with Misty and Simon in my small group. I think it's important to truly be vulnerable. You have to show your limitations, right? I think to sort of be really authentic. I've had leaders before who decided they had to be the smartest person in the room and know everything. And one, I think that's unachievable, and it's completely untenable as well. It's hard to maintain, but two, it doesn't really create a lot of room for other people to step forward. But just curious what, anybody else's experience with saying, I don't know is lately, or just any, Tara or Laurie, just thoughts on the responsibility of saying that as a leader.
Yeah, I have a thought on that. So I think that it's about boundaries, right? So and what Brene Brown would say is that vulnerability without boundaries is not vulnerability. So you always need to be thinking about who you're talking to, what the nature of your relationship, the power differential, right? So you wouldn't want to say to, a team that you're leading, or maybe your board of directors saying, I have no clue what I'm doing, and I'm terrified, right? That would be inappropriate, because you'd be crossing boundaries saying that to a group of people who are looking to you to lead them, right? And so as long as you're conscious of your boundaries, then you're coming from a place of authenticity and sort of the intent behind why you're saying I don't know, then it likely is going to land well, right? So it is about being thoughtful. So like maybe if it's something that everyone is looking to you to know, if you are going to scare them by saying you don't know, maybe you need to change the way in which you phrase it, right? Like I need more time to reflect on that so I can make sure that I have the right answer for you. It's kind of saying the same thing, but maybe it's a little bit more comforting to the person who might be alarmed if you're saying, I don't know. And then of course there's tone and body language, and if it's like oh my God, I don't know, versus I don't know, I can get you the answer to that, right? So there's a whole bunch of nuance in that I think, but it does come down to boundaries. It's such an important component of all of these, is understanding what your boundaries need to have in place, because when we cross boundaries, that's when things get messy and for yourself, and you know it once you've done it, and you can see it when people do it, right? And then you get that sinking feeling in your stomach. That's when you know you've crossed the boundary. Laurie, did you have something different to add to that?
No, I really agree. And I think that those boundaries depend, don't they, on the relationship that you've got with the people in your business, and your own sort of level of comfort with stepping into that space of authenticity, and how practiced you are at it, which is, I think, where the kind of the individual style of the leader and the culture of the company really come together. There are some company cultures where it's much easier for a leader to go, I don't know, let's talk about this and think about it ourselves without causing panic. There are others where that would very much do that because there's a culture built up of the direction coming from one place. I think for me that there's something to borrow in there as well around that maybe extends beyond. Tara, I agree with everything that you say there, but there are some things in, if you've got a strong culture as a business, that you can know. You can know your purpose, you can know your values, you can know those things to be true. And I think understanding some of the elements that you can come back to as a leader that sit a little bit more permanently in what we know to be true about ourselves can be so useful at times when so much of the other decision that sits before us can be so complicated or so challenging to understand. And so to be able to go, I don't know the exact answer to I can't predict the future. I don't know what's going to happen. What I do know is that the way we approach these kinds of things here is to do it like this, and that we're still committed to delivering on what it is we promise to ourselves and to each other all the time to the greatest possible extent. And I think when leaders turn back towards those elements of their culture in times of uncertainty, rather than turning away from them, that can help to start create stability for the people around you. And it can give you a bit more conviction, I think, as a leader, to be able to go, I think I do know what we stand for sufficiently, and I can still be open to suggestion and to comment and to invite perspective from other people around that too.
That's helpful, thanks.
Thanks, Laurie. I think that also resonates with me around, if you as a leadership team and as a group of executives, or however companies are structured, you have the baseline foundation set for what the rules of engagement are, and the tone that you're setting and the values that you are aligning with, then when you come to a point where you don't know the answer, the environment is already there to be quite generous, isn't it, in terms of allowing you to be a bit more vulnerable and a bit more uncertain and a bit more not all-knowing. If you've already created this framework that everybody trusts, and they just let you be, let you have an opportunity to not have the answers either, right? I think that's the other pressure that leaders feel when they're forced to speak. Sometimes they don't have the answer, but they feel like they need to have the answer, so they then just say something that doesn't necessarily resonate with their people or is hard to follow up on. So I think there's a lot of pressure on leaders. Like I feel like, you know, employees have a lot of pressure on them, but leaders have a lot going on for them right now, right? On an individual level, at a company level. So I don't know, does anyone have a closing thought around the culture piece that you'd like to add before we pop into talking a little bit about online interactions with leaders? Any closing culture thoughts?
More out of just curiosity to Tara or Laurie, just if there is a strong organizational culture that feels like the CEO or whomever the figurehead is quite disconnected from, is there a way to overcome that?
Yeah. I mean, it's really difficult to have a strong organizational culture that the CEO is disconnected from, for the reasons that Tara was talking to before. You know, if the leaders in the business can't model the culture that's there, there's a weakness in that culture, whether you like it or not. And I think the number of leaders that I talk to who operate in a kind of blissful ignorance about that kind of thing, because they never invite that feedback to themselves, and so are horrified to discover that they're out of kilter with their culture and that they don't recognize it. I really think I feel for them, and it really makes me think that what is happening in an organization that enables leaders to hear from their teams and to understand how they are doing in relation to the culture that they're presiding over in many ways, and to recognize where the disconnects are. And I think working with leaders to start to build that awareness of what's happening, what they're doing, what they're causing, if they're not aligned and understanding what their role is and what the impact is that their language and behavior has within themselves, they can't model that and be part of that for their organization.
Yeah, and that just reminds me of one of my all-time Brené Brown favorite quotes is, "Who you are is how you lead." Right, and if you don't know who you are, then you have no understanding of the impact that you're having on others.
Yeah, that's really important, Tara, and it speaks to something that Laurie popped in the chat around leadership starts with leading self, and the self-awareness that leaders need to bring as they navigate this kind of environment that we're in right now, and really, frankly, everyday interactions with people, right? So I guess that brings us back to how important it is to start with the individual. And the individual starts with you as the leader. It's not individual employees. It's you as an individual that you have to start with and start working on the hard stuff. So speaking of the hard stuff, it's been pretty hard the last little while to have conversations and be productive online. At least I've found that in some instances. And especially, I'm sure that, it's not business as normal for anybody right now. So Laurie and Tara, if we could just spend the last 7 or 8 minutes here, I'd love to get your input on leading in an increasingly complex world and leading in a world where many interactions are now taking place on Zoom calls or in some kind of electronic format. We don't have the benefit of the full eye contact, the nonverbals, the no distractions when you're having a one-on-one, for example. So what's your advice around what leaders should be thinking about when they're using their voice in situations like difficult conversations, town hall meetings, and anything in between those kinds of engagements right now?
So I think it all comes down to being intentional, more intentional. So I think the importance of communication skills for leadership has increased significantly in the sort of a virtual world. As you said, you can't inform people in an ad hoc way that you used to, wandering through the lunchroom and like, oh, Bev, I meant to tell you, blah, 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 or hi, Julie, I've been meaning to tell you this, because we don't have a coffee room anymore. And we can't build trust through those unplanned casual interactions because those aren't happening. And so if your approach is like, I'm going to lead by example, that's just what I'm going to do. I'm just going to lead by example. People will see what I'm doing. People aren't seeing you leading right now. So it's about being more intentional and more proactive in a virtual world. So I think it needs more frequent communication, shorter, and really focused. And so it's clearly articulating priorities and strategic intent and what your thought process is, and making sure everybody understands, checking in more regularly, being intentional about how are we building trust in our team. Like, I actually think there's just more work to be done via communication, where we used to be able to rely on more sort of just ad hoc casual interactions that would have provide us the opportunity to do that. Being really planned and well thought out, you lose people quickly in a virtual situation because it's hard to stay focused. Laurie's been on Zoom all morning, and you get Zoom fatigue. It's a real thing, and so being unprepared so that you meander all over the place, like, you just lose people, and we don't have the same patience on virtual, I think, than we had in sort of in person. So, scheduling more shorter one-on-one, staying connected, building in time to build trust, all of those things actually have to be intentional. They're just not going to happen on their own. Laurie?
Yeah, all of that, for sure, all of that. And I think, yeah, for me, it's getting back to some of the basics of communication. You know, most of leadership is communication to a large extent. So we've got to fit ourselves now into this new series of boxes that we find our faces in each day. And I think that ability to keep visible is so important, because people can't see and hear you unless you are there to be seen and to be heard. And I think it's ironic, because the thing that we want most from leaders right now is empathy. And the hardest thing to really get in a virtual world and connect to in many ways is empathy. It's so much easier when you're in person and you feel that relationship together. So it's a kind of a catch-22, but I think to build on that sort of intentionality and proactivity, it's what kind of conversations have to be happening right now. And I absolutely agree on the clarity of priorities and things that people need to hear, but we also need to make space for people to just connect with each other outside of some of that, and to continue with the trust building that happens at the water cooler or around the desk. We have to create spaces online for us to be able to do that kind of thing now. And I think as leaders, I see a lot of leaders right now kind of broadcasting at their business because that's the most concise way to use their time. And I think encouraging them to organize one-on-one chats with people at shorter notice, and just to be able to call people up almost and check in on how they're doing and hear how they are on a one-to-one basis, even on Zoom, can be so much more powerful for kind of driving that kind of piece. And I think in terms of content of communication, there's a lot of change going on right now. There's a lot of uncertainty. I'd love to see leaders come back to their values and to their purpose, and use that as a conversation around how change is going to be embraced and dealt with inside an organization. So not just here's what we're going to do next, but this is the way we're going to come together now to be able to navigate this kind of thing themselves. One of my clients in the UK, a CEO of an online mortgage broker, who really thought that they might lose their business altogether. The headline of his memo to his staff was, "Everything's open to change apart from our purpose and values. So come with ideas. I'm going to be figuring them out too. Nothing is sacred in what we do other than in the way that we do it and what we do it for." And that's an enormously rallying message to be able to give, and to be able to have a conversation around, remote or otherwise, I think.
Yeah, Laurie, and I think the other thing that the conversation that I often have is, there's a lot that's different, but there's still a lot that's the same. And so, like, what is the same in these situations? And instead of just focusing on what's different, I mean, the same, we can connect face to face, right? We can do all of these things. So helping people, I think people sometimes get overwhelmed with the thought of all of this has changed and everything's so different. And if you can help people focus on what is the same, and you can still do those things. You can still build trust. You can still have those connections. You can still connect one-on-one. Sometimes helps them wrap their heads around it.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thanks, Tara and Laurie. As we're edging towards the top of the hour here, does anyone have a 30-second share that they would like to add before we close off, just around your own experience as a leader showing up online right now?
Mine is just asking feedback. Like, it is a different experience. So as a leader, just asking feedback for how you're showing up online. Little body language things that you hadn't considered, or things that are off-putting. If you just ask people, and people are willing, and you have the culture where people are willing to give that response, I think that goes a long way too.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Erin. That's a really good point. And Simon made an equally good point around, there's a very real chance that these horrible leaders who were not doing things like asking for feedback and being empathetic in the real life world are just going to continue to, perpetuate their bad behaviors. So, you know, what do we do about those leaders who need more help than anyone? And maybe that's the conversation for the next chat here. But I'm sure, Simon, that Tara and Laurie would be happy to give you some thoughts offline about that, as we do need to start wrapping up here. But thank you everybody for coming today. I'm going away thinking about 3 things: empathy, self-awareness, and the need for more communication. Those 3 things for me, I feel, really wrap up all the things we touched on today. You know, I think it's an ongoing process of improvement for each of us as individuals who, you know, each and every one of us show up as a leader. We all contribute to our culture wherever we find ourselves. So if we each keep working on ourselves, the whole will be better for it. So thank you so much to Laurie and Tara for leading us through the conversation. And I do hope that you'll join us for the next one, which is actually an interesting extension of the online conversation around how do you have difficult conversations, like coaching conversations, feedback conversations, and mentoring conversations in an online format. So we have 2 guests joining us to talk us through that. So I do hope you will join us. And as always, it's been a delight, and I'm so grateful that you chose to spend this hour with us, and enjoy the rest of your day. And see you soon.